Good morning. Welcome to a fresh week of #LDeduchat Leadership Development in Education Online. We've got an immense lineup this week. Today we've got Sarah Chick and Nazam Latif, who'll be looking at deep dives in science. We'll be with Mary Myatt tomorrow. So excited about that. And then on Wednesday we have Razna Chowdhury. We then go into Dr. Emma Kell on Thursday, and then we've got Marcus Ray and hopefully a few more colleagues on Friday looking at maths deep dives as well. So there's a big mix of people from our trust, from outside our trust, and across the UK. I'm looking at the numbers there again. Monday morning, I am so impressed with you guys. We are looking to have a full house or towards a full house again today. I just want to say hi to those, and I had a look through the list. There's quite a few people again that have been to a lot of sessions, which is really, really good to see. Keep that up. So without any further ado,
good morning, and I hope this finds you well after a sunny weekend of VE Day celebrations. I'm here today to talk about my own experience of a science deep dive during an Ofsted inspection in January 2020, and also to offer some insights into the Section 8 inspection carried out at Chorney High School for Boys in the autumn term of 2019. Nazam Latif, who's Head of Science at Chorney High School for Boys, will hopefully be joining us for the live session, so that should offer two slightly different perspectives, as Chorney Boys School has been outstanding since 2002. My name is Sarah Chick, and I joined Chorney High School for Girls in September as Head of Science, having previously held SLT roles in education. However, although I was experienced, I joined a department where 4 of us were new in September, and with several non-specialists, we were also hugely aware that Ofsted was imminent, so that we knew there was a big job to do. Immediately, we were faced with a race against time, and on top of this, the school had been graded requires improvement in the 2 previous inspections. We faced an interesting challenge, but hopefully our journey goes to show that with the correct ingredients in place, it is possible to make a huge difference, even when time is of the essence. Here you can see what the inspectors did during the 2 inspections. On the left, Chorney High School for Girls, which was a Section 5 inspection, and on the right, Chorney High School for Boys. In terms of deep dives, this doesn't mean they're any less thorough, whether it's a Section 8 or a Section 5. There are just fewer of them in a Section 8. In the girls' school, we had 4 inspectors for the full time, and at the boys' school, they had 2 inspectors, with 1 on day 2. On these next 2 slides, I've included a schedule for the 2 schools for the 2 days, and you can see there's a striking similarity between both of them when we're looking at the deep dives. Here is the Chorney High School for Girls schedule for the deep dive in science. And you can see this began with a meeting with the subject leader, so myself, with my line manager in the inspection. We then spent 2 lessons, first of all with an assistant head accompanying the inspector visiting lessons, and secondly with myself accompanying the inspector visiting lessons, looking at what was going on in the classroom and carrying out lesson observations. During this time, the inspector selected students from Year 8 and Year 11 who came and joined her during period 3 with their books and were questioned about their time they spent in science. Following this, in period 4, lesson visits continued. And then during period 5, later in the afternoon, there was some document scrutiny, including curriculum overview time and reflection time by the inspector. This was then followed at the end of the school day by a meeting with department teachers, where we were all able to go and experience questioning together and offer our feedback. Finally, there was a work scrutiny session. It says here with the HOD, this was true in many cases, but in our case, actually, the entire department was part of this work scrutiny and booklet. If I then flick forward to the Chorney High Schools for Boys schedule, you can see how it's actually very, very similar. Just re-emphasising that point that there's very little difference between the 2 types of deep dive depending on the inspection. So moving on then, what are the key messages that are coming through from the education inspection framework? Curriculum, curriculum, curriculum is the big takeaway from this. I'll come back to the 3 I's later, but in terms of the curriculum, there's great importance placed on the sequencing to ensure long-term memory is an absolute priority. In our case, we worked with a consultant to ensure that the strong curriculum we already had in place was sequenced in a way that allowed learners to regularly revisit topics throughout Key Stage 3 and 4. Our Key Stage 3 is condensed into 2 years, so it was really important to emphasise how we ensured that all the content was still covered. This is where it was also really useful to have a knowledge of Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 5 to ensure that no gaps in knowledge occur. For example, if I take a topic such as cells, in Key Stage 2, students study plants, animals, classification and life cycles. So they come to us with that pre-knowledge. This is then built upon in Key Stage 3, where students look at the structure of cells. And then as they move into Key Stage 4, this structure is elaborated on by looking at the detailed function and specialism of cells, and also learning how to carry out microscope calculations. As they move on to study at Key Stage 5, I'm taking A-levels here, students will then, in A-level biology, look at the ultrastructure of organelles in cells, the structure of membrane, and other more detailed studies of the cell. As a department, we've also done a lot of work on long-term memory through looking at mastering memory and incorporating it into our schemes of learning. The deputy head is actually leading on this in the school and is a science teacher too. So that's been really, really useful in our department, because we've been able to be one of the departments trialling this at a deep level. Addressing subject knowledge gaps is also important. And for us, with a number of non-specialist teachers, it was particularly important. When I arrived in September, one of the first things we did was to audit the subject knowledge of all our staff in order to identify their individual needs, and then put together a plan to ensure personalised CPD for all staff. I'll come back to this later. Cultural capital has raised its profile in the new framework. And for us, this was an area where we were really able to shine. The profile of our students is such that their experience of the world is often quite limited. So ensuring we maximise opportunities to improve their science capital is critical. We did this by mapping out all of the activities beyond the standard curriculum and targeting them for specific groups of students. So you can see here what this mapping looks like. It's been split into extracurricular, which is what students do over and above their lesson to actually extend their understanding of the subject. Supercurricular, sorry, that was the supercurricular. Extracurricular, which is the more fun side of science outside of lessons. ELO, that's our extended learning opportunities or homework, and the interventions that we put in place for students. We separately also mapped out the careers work that we do with students to ensure that there are different levels of career advice being offered at all stages through our curriculum. So here, if I take 3 examples of how we've ensured that our extracurricular and supercurricular are targeted to particular groups of students, you can see in green in the middle, we've got the chick trip. Here, I actually worked with Nazam at the boys' school, and we took our LPA, or our lower previous attaining students, across to the boys' school to see some chicks that had been hatched out at the boys' school. This was really important for that group of learners because it gave them the opportunity to actually feel like something special had been done with them. And one of the pieces of feedback that had come back from our students the year before was that students felt that a lot of the extra opportunities were targeted to more able students. Looking again then at a different group, if we look at the blue, peer influences, peer mentoring, this is our mid-prior retainers and our pupil premium students who had in year 10 who this was aimed at. So for this activity, we actually worked with the students to get students to deliver revision sessions to year 9s. And again, this is really important for that group of learners. So we know that often pupil premium students don't necessarily have the opportunity to develop the same skills as other students. So working with other students actually helped to improve their career skills as well. And then in red, you can see the Sanger Centre. So here we actually selected students by their career interest. One of the things we have each week, as you can see under the super and extracurricular, is, under the lesson enrichment, is a career of the week. So in year 9 and year 11, students have a career of the week, and through this work we've done, we selected the students to go and visit the Sanger Centre. So having looked at some of the key changes, let's take a look at the different aspects of the deep dive in a little more detail. So looking first at the subject leader meeting, this is your key opportunity to share what you'd like to portray about the department, but it's also imperative that you're ready to answer any questions posed. Don't feel that everything has to be the completed article. Everybody's on a journey, and it's about knowing where you are on this journey and how you're making sure that you're on a journey to improve your work over time. In our case, one of the first things I did was to develop a 3-year plan. Biggest priority for me was getting the team together to gel when I first arrived and to create a shared identity. So to do this, we created a shared vision, which I'll come back to in a minute. And then this influenced our 3-year plan. So for us, I was very lucky to join the department on the back of a really good set of results and very good progress. So with a very new team and a number of non-specialists, in year 1, the real priority was actually to maintain this very good set of results and the good level of progress whilst improving our pedagogy along the way. You can see then, as we move forward into year 2, that then looks at aspiring to be an outstanding department in the school and sharing our work across the school. And then as we move into year 3, this becomes more about not only developing our practice and trying to be at the forefront of practice in science, but then sharing this right across the trust. Secondly, be prepared. It is possible to prepare for the meeting, so make sure you do. In my case, I took in a PowerPoint to the meeting with me. In the PowerPoint, there was our 3-year plan, the 3 I's, a leadership model, the curriculum plan summary, the extracurricular and supercurricular mapped out, careers mapped out. And so all this was there ready for the inspector to see. So you can see here the shared vision that we came up with as a department almost as soon as I arrived. This was really, really important to us to know that we were all aspiring to the same thing. And for us, it was also about not just preparing students for A-level study or to go on to university to study science, but actually to ensure that while students were in the department, they were all scientists being trained to make informed scientific decisions in society, whether or not they went on to actually use science for their career. So here you can see what this looks like, how we build the skills and knowledge over time with the students to ensure that we get them to this place. Moving on to the implementation, you can see how this looks on the ground. Through our curriculum model, we integrate whole school priorities such as the mastering memory and oracy. And also, we're at the bottom here, you can see that we're working on the science capital, as I've already spoken about. Finally, our impact could be a whole separate PowerPoint by itself, and it centres around across the school around reaching or exceeding a target flight path. The subject of assessment is obviously a very deep one, but in a nutshell here, we've made sure that you've considered how the department assessment policy fits with the school policy and enables all students to track their own improvement. In our case, students sit end of modules tests at the end of each topic, and these are complemented by a system of homeworks of online revisiting material and long answer questions. These next few slides show examples of questions you might be asked in your meeting. Those that are coloured blue have already been touched upon. The white ones are for you to take away and consider, and the pink questions are those that I'll share now on how we answered. For example, the first pink question, how is your teaching of graphs aligned with maths and geography curriculum? In our case, we actually carried out a joint project with the maths department, which we're still building upon, looking at how graphs differ between science and maths and aligning the two schemes of learning so that students learn about the graphs that we study in science during their maths lessons too. Just to explain this a little bit more, for example, in maths they rarely use curves of best fit, whereas in science this is quite common. And so the maths department actually integrated this into their teaching, and this piece of work still continues, looking at how we can better complement each other all the time. In terms of the second pink question, how does your curriculum planning prepare pupils for what they will receive in years 9, 10 and 11? One of the areas of weakness we identified was that when students met required practicals in Key Stage 4, they hadn't been hugely well prepared for them in Key Stage 3. As a result, we carried out a project in our department which actually looked at ensuring that there was a practical in every module during Key Stage 3, be carried out in a similar style to a required practical in Key Stage 4. This means that students coming through to Key Stage 4 are then far better prepared for the demands of practicals at GCSE level, and we're starting already to notice the difference with that. So examples of the types of questions you might get with implementation. The pink one we'll have a look at here is, in terms of curriculum, what would we expect to see in the lessons that we're visiting today? This is where, again, it's really, really important to be prepared in those meetings, because if you're sensible before you go into the meeting, you'll have your overview of the curriculum with you, so you know exactly what teachers are supposed to be teaching in which classrooms. You can also then ensure that you've taken this information from individual teachers, and if you're actually really canny, you can ensure that you can talk to the inspector about, even where students will be doing the same lesson across 4 different sets, how that might look different between the different ability ranges. And finally, example questions on impact. The questions we'll look at here: will we see this progression when we look at the pupils' books? And what does this look like? When we're asked this, you have to actually consider from the pupils' point of view how progress looks. So from our side, what we do with this is, in order to match up progress with our flight paths, every test that students take actually comes with a flight path attached to it after it's been marked, so students can see where they sit, and then it tells them what they need to do to move to the next flight path. They can then do what we call fix it, which is going on and actually correcting their questions, so they can then go back to that flight path and see what that progress looks like. We were able to show this during our booklet, where the inspector asked us to show progress in a book and how a student had improved over time. So that was a really, really useful way of doing it. And finally, in the subject leader meeting, triangulation is really, really important. Really consider what this looks like to all stakeholders, and consider what everyone will say when questioned about a particular aspect of practice. If, for example, you speak about a shared vision, but no one else can articulate it, an inspector will quickly see through this. Thread and embed has been used by both schools, and it was an overriding theme with us from SLT to student that the inspectors were really impressed by, as the message was so consistent. So just to reiterate, really, here's a list of questions that students could be asked. And it's well worth contemplating what the student perspective might be if they're asked some of these. They don't tend to be in the same language as the questions that are asked to staff. So you can see here, what are you learning in science today? What do your teachers do to support you? Which piece of work are you most proud of? How can you show that teacher feedback has supported you? So these are in student speak. But if that thread is running right through, then the student should give an answer that is in keeping with everybody else, SLT, right through the department. Finally, onto the meeting with teachers. I was lucky enough actually to be part of this meeting, and here the heavy focus was really, really on CPD and wellbeing. In fact, the first question that was asked in my presence was, how well do you feel supported do you feel by your head of department? This was where really, really taking time to know my department paid dividends. In our case, all our staff were able to talk at length about personalised CPD, both formal and informal. For example, when new staff arrived in the department and those non-specialists who we had in the department, they were all buddied up immediately with a more experienced member of staff, and time was put aside for them to meet with that member of staff in order to help move their practice forward. This is obviously rather informal, and alongside this other informal CPD, we have each week what we call requisition parties. No, not so much a party, but actually where the department gets together to order their equipment for the following week. It's a really, really good forum for bouncing ideas off each other. And so without necessarily separating out and doing specific training at specific times for members of staff, it gives everybody the opportunity to speak to members of staff who have different specialisms to see what the best way is to carry out, for example, a practical. We also, in the department, have a number of aspiring leaders. So one of the things that we looked at was a model of distributed leadership across the department. So you can see here on the left-hand side the areas of responsibility that I've taken on. This includes the line management of 3 staff, but actually in this model of distributed responsibility, everybody has a chance to line manage in order to develop their own skills for future leadership. Alongside this, the members of staff the other TLR holders take it in turns to deputise on a Friday, which is my SLE day. So again, getting that experience so that they can look at their next steps. In terms of the trust, we're able to really talk well about how we manage to train our staff up through the trust. So the trust that we are in have regular meetings that are subject specific, where the entire department attend and actually learn together about science on a wider scale. We also, as I said before, have some non-specialists in the department, and our weakest area in department, as with many other science departments, is physics. So we've sent 2 of our non-specialists on a course for physics for non-specialists being run by the trust. This has been really, really helpful because it's meant that those members of staff can then come back into the department and share their knowledge they've learned. As well as the less experienced staff, we also have several members of SLT in the department who have, in their own way, been able to develop their practice too. So, for example, I spoke earlier about our deputy head who has been doing a lot of work on mastering memory. So she's managed to develop her own CPD whilst bringing this back into the department, which is really powerful because it means we're receiving instruction from all levels. As head of department, I've also had the privilege of sitting on the British Science Association General Committee and been allowed to continue that through the years so that I go out and then bring back in that cutting edge scientific knowledge into the department. So that pretty much brings me to the end of my presentation. But if I had to summarise the 4 main takeaways, it would be these. Firstly, it's that creating a shared vision and then knowing how it's realised by intent, implementation and impact by all stakeholders. And by that I mean, what does it look like at SLT level? What does it look like at departmental level? And then what does it look like once it reaches the students? How do they see that vision applying directly to them? Secondly, is that really, really powerful pre-preparation of taking key documents into the subject leader meeting. In my case, I know that I offered them to the Ofsted inspector and these were taken away, and I know they were used because the questioning later on involved questions that came from those documents. So it's well worth the time spent, because in that half an hour brief meeting, you can't possibly have the time to put across everything that you want to. Thirdly, a real key point is what makes the department outstanding. And I say it in that way because actually, if you're going to be outstanding, by definition of that word, you have to stand out. So what is it about your department that actually is different to everybody else and has the edge? In our case, it was about that mapping of the supercurricular, the extracurricular and careers for every student, so that we had a real deep understanding of science that wasn't just restricted to the core curriculum. And then finally, it's the strong focus on CPD. Know your staff, know their needs, and ensure that they get the professional development they need, so they have the freedom to be able to come back and share this with the department. So many thanks for listening. I hope it's been helpful, and I look forward now hopefully to joining Nazam in a moment to taking some live questions. Thank you.
Just starting off, questions that have come up, there have been fewer, obviously, I think people are thinking about what they want to ask. Anything that's jumped out to you in the things that have come up? Either Sarah?
Yeah, okay, I can pick up a question from Nikki Goodman, first of all, so thank you, Nikki. And she asked, how is the extracurricular mapped out? And obviously that was an area that was really unclear, so you couldn't see it online. But this is something that we've looked to do to set ourselves apart. So firstly, this has come from quite a lot of experience working with universities, and universities much more now talk about supercurricular rather than extracurricular. So they talk about, I mentioned it in the presentation, but what you do over and above your lessons in order to improve your subject knowledge, rather than just extra science club for fun kind of thing. So we separated the extracurricular and the supercurricular, and we also mapped out careers and homeworks. They were separated by year group and then also by ability profile. And I think I said in the presentation, there was feedback from students last year that they felt like quite a lot of the extracurricular only focused on the most able. So what we did is we've made sure now we've got some open extracurricular and supercurricular offers that everybody can tap into, but then also we try and pinpoint particular abilities or pupil premium students or people with particular interest in careers.
Nazam?
There seems to be quite a few questions here on Key Stage 2 and Key Stage 3 phasing in. Yeah. I'll try and answer this to the best of my ability. What needs to happen initially is work needs to be done in mapping out Key Stage, the national curriculum for Key Stage 2. Once that's been established and you've grasped an understanding of what students should have learned in the national curriculum for Key Stage 2, you then need to start looking at the Key Stage 3 curriculum, and where through initial assessments early on in Year 7, you will find the gaps in learning at Key Stage 2. You can address these gaps naturally through learning, and there will also be opportunities where you will see a clear thread of learning. So, for instance, in Key Stage 2, you will have noticed that there's an extract where students need to learn about plants, and this is further elaborated at Key Stage 3. If students haven't learned about plants at Key Stage 2, well, that can be addressed at Key Stage 3 by investing an additional few minutes and recapping prior knowledge. And this, again, can be fed into Key Stage 4. So what we need to look at is a clear thread of learning through all three key stages. And also, if it's within your capacity, start looking at Key Stage 5 and start building your curriculum in cleverly, so you're having a holistic view of the entire thread of learning.
I think going between settings, again, as with last week with Nikki, and you've touched on it just there in terms of how do you pick up on the gaps, etc. So obviously, some of the questions are to do with how does it differ within primary school and moving through the different settings in terms of Key Stage 3, Key Stage 4. Is there anything fundamentally that you've picked up on that's different, say, within a primary setting? Because obviously with something science, it could possibly be a little bit more technical in terms of, like, you've got more of the practicals, you've got all those different aspects. Is there anything different that would need to be highlighted within primary as opposed to secondary?
Yeah, I think that, the obvious clear difference between the primaries and the secondaries is the lack of specialist equipment in the primary schools, and often a lack of specialist subject teachers in primary who are relying on learning subject knowledge rather than bringing it in. So really, no, I don't have a specific answer. I mean, if you look at the Key Stage 2 topics, then they're designed so that they can be taught in primary. So for us in secondary, we know if we take something like the plant cells and animal cells, we know students are going to come in with broad knowledge about animals and plants. But then it's really our job to drill down into, the more scientific side of it in terms of the microstructure and things at that time. I think there's also a really, really good opportunity in a lot of schools for doing work with the feeder schools. With us, it's quite difficult because we have so many feeder schools, but particularly in schools where there are smaller numbers, then, there's opportunities for working directly with them and finding out what they deliver and which courses they deliver and how and at which time. I think it's something that is more and more valuable as the students move through where possible.
Nazam, I picked up on one question there, and I know that you've done some work, and so have you, Sarah, regarding, they said, do you come up with your assessments or your assessment protocol for the year at the beginning of the year, or do you actually make it quite responsive throughout the year, depending on how the various cohorts actually progress? How do you deal with it at Chiltern Boys? Just very quickly, you might have picked up on the video, but I'm just going to clarify again. Sarah works at Chiltern High School for Girls. She's head of department there at SLE, and Nazam works at Chiltern Boys, and he's head of science there. So just from those people that hadn't picked it up on the video, I just wanted to double remind them. So responsive or planned out from the beginning?
The assessments, the bulk of the work is done at the start of the academic year. These are then tweaked to the abilities of our year group. So higher and foundations assessments are developed during the course of the year, but we encourage assessments to be made at the start of the year if you're familiar with your setting. If you're new to the school, then I'd say you will need to park the idea, wait for the first topic to be taught, and then you grasp an idea of the cohort, the ability group, and you can tailor your assessments according to that. But if you've been at a school for a lengthy period of time, then I would assume you know your setting and you know your intake. But a bulk of the work I would encourage to be done, in fact, earlier than September, in the downtime that you gain in the summer during the year 11 time would be a perfect opportunity for you to develop some of those assessments.
Yeah, and sorry. Yeah,
I was going to say, sorry, if you wanted to add to that, or if you've got a different question.
Yeah, I'd say similarly to that. So Sean Davis, thank you for that question. We primarily design our assessments at the start of the year because they're tailored to our flight paths. So there needs to be quite specific feedback so students can know how to improve. Saying that, of course, there's always split classes. There are things that end up being taught in different ways than you would have hoped at the start of the year. So there is some tweaking involved. For example, if we have two teachers teaching two different topics at the same time, rather than doing separate tests, we might put those tests together or something similar. So yeah, broadly pre-designed, but with that kind of adaptability. And shall I move on to a question?
Yeah.
Okay, so this has come up a couple of times. So thank you to Tina Whitaker and Charlotte Cole, who've both asked about how we audit staff and their CPD needs. So the audit that we actually used was one that we had from teacher training. We brought through from initial teacher training, which looked at people, it looked at the subject knowledge very specifically rather than anything else. But it allowed people to rate how confident they felt with teaching different topics. It was quite extensive, and asking people that and then bringing that information together was quite a lengthy process. But you'll have noticed that there is much more of an increased focus on subject-specific CPD. And then the question went on to say, how do you ensure that your CPD is about needs rather than people's wants? And actually, I think these two things, if you've got the climate right in your department, are largely interchangeable, because you want people to be ambitious, and where their ambitions involve, self-improvement, they're going to do, in my personal opinion, is they're going to do far, far better if they have some say in what that self-improvement is, rather than being put on a course for a specific reason. That's not to say that doesn't happen at various points, that does sometimes happen, or people suggest courses, but kind of detailed and sensitive line management is what comes into play at that time. So making sure that you know the staff you're working with really well, and you know their needs, and you know those ambitions, and then those two things actually tend to match up, I've found so far.
And I just think from a leadership point of view, I think that's really important what you've said, and that's actually not even to do with science. It's to do with anywhere within a school setting, giving a little bit of ownership where possible. I think really improves the discretionary effort that staff put in terms of developing resources, lessons and teaching within the department. So I think that's a really, really good point there, Sarah. Nazam?
I've got a question here. Would you say that inspectors would be looking for evidence of staff CPD? They would most certainly like to hear from you and your staff that they are enrolled on CPD. They don't necessarily want to see any CPD, but this would be evident through the quality of teaching and the impact you're having on the ground level. But coming back to the point Sarah made in the PowerPoint, there will be triangulation. They will be verifying your what you've told them with what the students are saying, and with what the staff who are working under your leadership are also saying. So this will be verified through a conversation.
I think you're absolutely right there, and I think the threads run throughout all the ones that have dealt with Ofsted in terms of the sessions that we've run. in terms of people asking for what documentation do we produce, what evidence they're looking for, I would say that 90% of what's needed, or even 95% of what's needed, especially at middle leader and downwards in terms of going to teaching staff and departments, it's actually through discussion. They'll talk to everybody and they'll triangulate that information, and it's going to become very clear whether things are happening in the way that you're saying or not, amongst all the different stakeholders. So I think it's really important just to stress that people are not looking for documentation to prove what you're doing. They will ask you, but they'll ask other people as well. And we've got to sing the same voice that we're doing these things if we're doing them. Sarah, jump straight into your next question. Then we'll go to a live question after this.
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on a question from Chris Redding about middle schools, and middle schools are quite close to my heart, having spent a lot of my teaching career in an upper school. Shout out to Wootton Upper. So Chris has asked, any advice to middle schools? They're in a similar position in terms of Ofsted as the girls' school, and non-specialist staff feature heavily in the department. I would say here that actually the big advantage middle schools and upper schools have when working together is there tend to be fewer feeder schools, because the year groups in middle schools are obviously bigger. And so I think that is where you can do a better job of working individually and really knowing where your students are coming from. So when I was head of science at an upper school, we did exactly that. We had regular meetings with our middle school feeders and actually got to the point where the middle schools were delivering the same core curriculum. So we knew what they were coming up to upper school with. And I know that's a bit idealistic, and it did take us a long time to get to that point, but it is possible. And I think it is, as you say, an area where you are quite different to that primary secondary feeder model, but you can also make it work.
Nazam?
I'm picking up on a question here. Can you summarize the curriculum intent? Now, the intent, in other words, is the knowledge and the understanding to be gained at key stage 3 or key stage 4 or whatever key stage. This question is tailored to your school. There's no one standard answer for any school. You will need to look at your setting, your environment. Are you located close by to a science community? Are there science jobs in the vicinity of your school? The cohort that you're teaching is also part of the content. So your curriculum must be tailored to the needs of your school. Yes, you can purchase a curriculum from a popular UK curriculum provider. Again, you need to show evidence that you've tailored that to the needs of your cohort. So again, and this for the II questions, intent, implementation, and impact, it's tailored to your school.
Perfect. And again, that thread's been running through, and I've had a few emails and tweets and stuff like that, can we have a copy of an intent, can we have that, and it's really important to note that the intent is specific to your setting, to your school, to your students. You can see examples of what it looks like, but it needs to follow through with what you have in front of you in your school. So that's a really, really good point. And Stuart Locke is going to be looking at in one of our later sessions, actually looking specifically at the 3 I's, and actually going through, and he'll actually be dealing with those issues in a lot more depth. But just make sure that if you want to have examples, there are examples available, but you've still got to make it personal and individual to your school. And then it's going to apply to each aspect of your school as well. So an intent is for the school, but also filtering all the way through to every single part of your school in terms of how are you, or what are your aims for your students in the setting that you have your school. I've got Charity.
Oh, good morning.
Good morning, Charity.
Thank you so much for today. It's really been quite useful. But my main question is, how do you instill confidence in your staff and students to ensure they feel very capable of having these conversations with inspectors? It could be quite daunting for students indeed, and for staff.
Great question, Charity.
Yeah, I think, morning, Charity. From my side, when I started in department, we had a lot of new staff and some non-specialists. And so it was really about that working together to know that firstly, we were all coming from the same place, but secondly, that they were trusted to do their job and do their job well, rather than that being constantly kind of scrutinised in what they were doing. So, you know, one of the things I said to the department very, very early on was, you know, please have the confidence to go out and teach as you see best, and to use the resources that you see best to do that. So really trying to work on those levels of confidence and talking with staff to make sure that they know that's the case. With the non-specialists, it was about having somebody to hold their hands, and I talked about the buddy up scheme, and we tried to do that, or have with our non-specialists, make sure that they were either buddied up, or they really, really knew that there was someone they could go to and say, hey, you know, I've got to teach microscopes next week to year 7. What does that look like? What lessons have you got? How would you recommend I do it? So it was about just developing that confidence in the staff. With the students, it's obviously a bit of a slower game, but for me, it's about the relationship and the relationship with the teacher, with that class. There's also some explanation. I think, you know, actually the school that I'm at, the students are almost so used to staff coming in and out of the room that there was, you know, which is a brilliant thing, you know, open classroom policy, but they'd almost got to the point where they wouldn't in any way kind of clock it. And so there was a little bit of working with students to say, you know, if somebody comes in the room, please make sure you greet them. Please make sure you ask them if there's anything they want to know from you, and doing a little bit of, you know, work with them to ensure that they knew what their role was going to be, and that they knew what the expectations were when somebody came into the room, which, you know, mostly the girls were absolutely delighted to take on and do.
Quite a good place sort of to round that up in terms of how do you get that thread running through all the stakeholders that you find within a school and connected to a school, because obviously we have parents as well. It might just be worthwhile just pointing out, obviously those surveys still go out to parents, the questionnaires during Ofsted, etc., and that if they do ask subject specific questions, if they do, then obviously you want to make sure that the parents are also engaged at some level with what you're trying to do within your department. I think that's quite important too. Anything else that's come up on the questions? I think we've got time for one more question that somebody's asked. Is there anything else that you've seen, Nazam?
I can see Victoria's asked a question here.
Yeah.
During your deep dive, did inspectors look at previous exam review analysis, and did they ask for evidence of how you are addressing any weaknesses? Well, inspectors would have an idea of your exam results prior to them coming to your school. This may have been handed to them on the very first day of their visit, so they'll be aware of your prior attainment. They're not interested in your internal trackers, and that's an important point to make. In the new published Ofsted criteria, they're not looking for in-school assessments. There may be discrepancies among schools, but during your conversations with them, you can bring up the areas of development at your school, and again, this will be emphasised and reinforced in your department improvement plan. So when you have those documents at hand, you can talk through them prior to them asking you, but they may potentially ask you how you are dealing with some of the weaknesses in your department. So please make sure that you're aware of your department, your staff are aware of what the department improvement plan strategies are, because they may be drawn upon during their triangulation meeting.
I think just to also just add to what you've just said, in terms of internal data, what they're not looking for is you showing progress through that in the same way that we saw before. But do use, like you've said, Nazam, in terms of if you're looking to highlight gaps in terms of strengths and weaknesses within your department as well, that's something that you can draw on from internal assessment and say, you know, this is how we identified the things that we needed to focus on, and these are the things that we've looked at and how we've improved on in terms of how the students engage. They remember more of what they've been taught, which is the new way of looking at progress. And one of the things that you'll be drawing on is how your assessments reflect that. They won't be looking for the grades that you give on the assessments, they'll be looking at actually what they're learning and whether you can use that. So don't think that internal data isn't important. It's important to move your department forward and for you then to use that as a mechanism to show that. But they won't be looking for detailed sheets of this. It will be a discussion again in terms of they'll ask you. Is that pretty much how it went with within the departments, Sarah, when they came into science and Cheltenham Girls?
Yeah, there was actually almost zero focus on the assessment outcomes and past assessment outcomes. I think for us, we were in a position where we had a really good set of results the year before, and whether that influenced things, I don't know. But we have all been led to believe there's going to be far less focus on the actual assessment and data and spreadsheets, and that was true. I wasn't asked for any of that at all. It wasn't delved into. Those questions were really answered live by seeing what the students were doing, speaking to the staff, rather than going through spreadsheets.
Definitely, yeah. Okay, I think that's the end of our session today. I just want to say a massive thank you. I know how hard both of you worked to put the information together, and I said this information will be made available. So I'd like to thank you, Sarah, for your time over the last week or so, and for you, Nazam, again, working collaboratively as two schools online, because obviously social distancing means we can't sit in the same room and work on these projects. So thank you so much, and thank you so much for your time. Okay, so at the end of our first session this week, I'm just going to pull up for you what's coming up this week. This week we have got, we've just had Sarah and Nazam, as you've just seen. Tomorrow we have Mary Myatt back on track, and exciting. She's got some new material to share with us, so really excited to look at that. Then we've got Razna Chowdhury from Denby High School, again one of our outstanding schools, creating a whole school maths culture. And then we've got Dr. Emma Kell, who will be looking at wellbeing for teachers working from home. I think absolutely poignant, especially moving forward into this next phase that we've got now, and actually dealing with the emotions of what we've just been through since the end of March. And then we have Marcus Ray, who you will have found on Twitter a few weeks ago, and he'll be looking at deep dives, and we'll be looking at maths in particular. So that will end our deep dives series in terms of the 3 core subjects. At Chiltern TSA, go on Twitter. If you haven't joined Twitter, join Twitter. There's so much to be gleaned from there in terms of resources and help and support, especially at this time that we're actually not able to work in the same ways that we could before. So at Chiltern TSA, follow us, have a look at what we're producing. There's lots of other stuff. Everything that we're doing at the moment is completely free. Please, please, please engage with us online. Really, really want to hear what you think about the sessions that we're running, and how we can offer you more or improve what we're giving you. Crucial week this week, and I just want to sort of round up by saying, obviously after yesterday's announcement, there'll be lots of information and questions flying around about the different settings that we have. Primary was mentioned in terms of reception year 1 and year 6, and secondary schools regarding those that have exams next year. Obviously there'll be a lot more meat added to the bones this week in terms of how this actually looks and what we're looking at in terms of your tests. Stay connected, stay inquisitive, stay curious, ask the questions, and most of all, stay safe. Stay safe, and I shall see you tomorrow. That's me, Arv Cowshaw, signing off for another session of #LDeduchat.